Okay, so I'm going to continue now with U.S. History Regents exam. This is June of 2017, and we'll be picking up with question 15 from the previous video. And once again, using these questions, it's not just about getting the right answer to this question, but understanding the issue. We're using this as a sort of launching point for review of the material. Okay, so question 15. Which statement is a valid generalization about the experience of African Americans during the early Reconstruction period, 1865 to 1870? Okay, so first of all, notice a couple of things. We're talking about the early Reconstruction period. 1865 is the end of the Civil War. 1870, of course, is just about 5 years later. Reconstruction is that period of time right after the Civil War when the United States, now having defeated the forces of the Confederacy, surrender's taken place, war is over, has to find a way to get the South, if you will, functioning again. It's been 4 years since they've had members of Congress sitting in Washington participating in government. The South was devastated by the war. The South, as you remember, had little in the way of industry, not much in the way of natural resources. The North had an advantage over the South when it came to just about everything except cotton, rice, and mules. And I'm not saying that lightly. The South, the major agricultural crop was, of course, cotton, and their entire economy was based on it. The South produced very little else. Some of the coastal areas of the South produced rice, which is useful, of course, as a food, but not an overwhelming amount of it. And the South had mules, which, as you know, are a crossbreed between a horse and a donkey, which makes them very strong, stocky, but smaller than a horse, and useful for doing things like pulling heavy wagons and that sort of business, which would be useful on the cotton plantations. The North had more horses, which gave them an advantage in their army and cavalry. It had more factories and metalworking establishments, right? So a foundry, metalwork, that's where you make swords, bayonets, and the metal that you need for guns, which are made in armories or gun factories. The North had much more of all of that. The North had a much larger population. Immigrants tended to go to the North because that's where the jobs were in the big industrial cities. In agriculture, the North produced more wheat, barley, oats, all of which are basic foodstuffs for people and for your livestock. It produced more in the way of cattle, beef cattle, more in the way of milk cows. So the North had a much larger population of men to draw on, much larger supply of food, factories to make cloth for uniforms, factories to make war material. And it just had more money. There was just more cash in the North. So from the day that the South fired the first gun at Fort Sumter that started the Civil War, it could not possibly have won that war. That's why Lincoln, as you recall, insisted on the Anaconda Plan, as it was called, which was the plan to blockade the South, to cut off the South from any imports from Europe. Without imports of all of that material, the South could not possibly survive. So when Lincoln used the Navy to cut off the South from imports by sea, and between the Army and the Navy took control of the Mississippi, it Mississippi River, it cut the South off from any hope of getting enough outside supply to win the war. During the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And the thing to remember about that, it did not free any slaves. Lincoln issued this document, the Emancipation Proclamation, which said all those still in slavery in counties still in rebellion against the United States are free. But a county that was in the South that was still in rebellion wasn't going to listen to that, so they didn't free any slaves. The real purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation was to make the war undeniably about slavery. And Britain and France, that were sympathetic to the South, that liked to see the United States weakened, that were willing to help the South because that's where they imported the cotton for their industries from. They also had abolished slavery themselves years before the United States, and their people would not have gone along with a war simply to keep slavery going in the South. Because of that, whatever hope the South might have had that Britain or France would enter the war on their side ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. That was really the point of it. So when the war ended, the South was not only defeated, but it had spent every dime it had. It had lost a much higher percentage of manpower than the North had in death in the war. And its economy had been totally destroyed. So the question was, how do we rebuild the South, get it going again? The other question, of course, is how do we do that in a world where now African Americans are free? As you know, at the end of the war, the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment declared that all previous people who were previously slaves are now citizens with equal protection of the law. And the 15th Amendment said that the newly freed slaves had the right, just as much right to vote as anybody else. So women couldn't vote still, but an African-American man could not be barred from voting just because he was black or just because he had formerly been a slave. So Reconstruction was about fitting the newly freed slaves into a Southern society that itself had to be rebuilt from pretty much nothing into a functioning part of the country again. From 1865 to 1870, excuse me, that early part of Reconstruction was very aggressive. The Republicans in Congress, and remember Lincoln was a Republican, really wanted to both punish the South and make sure that the old white power structures down there, the big landowners who had run the South and who had run the Confederacy, did not return to power and did not re-enslave, if you will, the blacks in some way. After 1870, you begin to see all that loosen. And the later part of Reconstruction, that old Southern power structure starts to reassert itself, and blacks find themselves increasingly being shut out of economic opportunity until 1876. It's the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. Reconstruction ends. The Southern power structure, which is now the Democratic Party, was at the time the Democratic Party in the South, is given what was called the free hand, and you begin to see, or you really see more aggressively, all of those Jim Crow segregation laws come in. Okay, well, that's the total picture. So this question is asking about the early part of Reconstruction. And what is a valid generalization about the experience of African Americans? One, they gained economic equality. Not true. Can't be. Newly freed slaves were freed, but they were freed with nothing in their pockets. You're free, but so what? So they didn't own land. They didn't have They had not been educated in a trade other than working on the cotton plantations for the most part. They, if you remember, the Freedmen's Bureau is set up by the North, by the United States government in the South, to provide some assistance to the newly freed slaves. But certainly the freed slaves were very poor and had to figure it all out. They certainly were not didn't achieve economic equality with the white landowners. Number two, their participation in government decreased. Well, first of all, their participation in government before this had been zilch, zero. So it couldn't go down. And 1865 to 1870, any man who had served in the Confederate Army or in the Confederate government was barred from voting and from holding office. Initially, Congress kept all of those guys who had taken an oath of loyalty to the Confederacy out of government. That all changed by 1876, but in this early part, that was the case. Well, who in the South was left who hadn't somehow taken part in the Confederacy? And the answer was a few very poor whites who were regarded by Southerners as, quote, scalawags. A few whites from the North came down to the South, and because they were allowed to vote when they moved there, they took over some government offices. Those were known as the carpetbaggers. And African Americans. Those first few years, blacks could vote, and they could get elected to office. And so the state governments, you had a lot of the newly freed slaves were actually in there. Again, by the mid-1870s, 1875, 1876, that all ends. They push them out. They create new laws to keep them there. But early on, their participation in government increased, so that's not our choice. They achieved legal rights through constitutional amendments. That's a possibility. I just said the Reconstruction amendments passed right at the end of the war, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. First, 13th abolished slavery completely, so they're now free. 14th said anybody born in the United States, including the ex-slaves, are now citizens and have equal protection before the law. Slaves had no such thing. They were not citizens, and they weren't even considered people in the law. And the 15th Amendment said that you could not bar somebody from voting just because they were black or had been a slave. You could still bar them from voting because they were under 21. You could still bar them from voting if they were a woman. But adult black men did have the vote. So they did get that. And number 4, their political equality was opposed by most radical Republicans. Just the opposite. The radical Republicans were the ones who wanted to give blacks their freedom, their political power, and all of that. So the correct answer to number 15 there is number 3. More important is that you understand why. Because you're probably not going to see that specific question again, but you will see the issue. Number 16, the system of sharecropping developed in the South after the Civil War. Let's remember what sharecropping is. Southern landowners, right after the war, right, they still own their plantations, but they don't have any slaves to work on it. And the slaves, the ex-slaves now, they don't have any job. So how are they going to make enough to live on? So they came up with this system of sharecropping. The plantation owners divided their plantations into smaller units. Okay, so they would stick a fence around a few acres, and they would rent that to a black family. The black family owed the plantation owner, then the landowner, rent in the form of a share of the crop, hence sharecropping. So the owner of the land would go to this black family, told them what they had to grow on that land. They didn't have a choice about what they wanted to farm. He told them, you're going to grow cotton. And the rent for the land is, half your crop. So you get to keep half of it, and you can go sell that and make money on it. I get the other half of the crop. Well, that maybe sounds like an okay deal until you realize that their half of the crop never really paid their expenses. So they would sell their half, but because it was so little, they never made enough to pay for their food, new equipment, any of that, which meant they often borrowed it from the landowner. So now they not only give him half their crop, but they owe him money. And so they're kept in this constant cycle of poverty. The landowner, because he's taking half their crop, but he's taking half the crop of hundreds of sharecropping farmer families, and he's selling that off, he's got no expenses. He's not giving them anything. So he's making plenty of money. But they're the ones who are kept in poverty, and they never make enough money to be able to buy any land of their own or move anywhere else. So the sharecropping system initially looked like a way that the landowners could get some rent and the ex-slaves could make a living off the land. But in fact, what it turns into is a way to keep the ex-slaves now permanently tied to the land and permanently in poverty. So it was a kind of economic enslavement. Okay, it developed in the South after the Civil War because, well, most formerly enslaved persons had no farming skills. Not exactly true. The formerly enslaved persons mostly had been in farming of one kind or another. They hadn't owned their own farms, but they knew how to do it. At least they knew how to do it on a basic level. So that might be our correct answer. Owners of large tracts of lands faced labor shortages. Oh, that might not be our correct answer, excuse me. It says formerly enslaved persons had no farming skills. So that can't be true. That's not right. Number 2, owners of large tracts of land faced labor shortages. Well, that was true. No more slaves. They needed somebody to work the land. Sharecropping was a way to do it. Much farmland was ruined by the war. That's true. At least it was initially ruined, but sharecropping doesn't fix that. And plantation owners wanted to diversify crops. Diversify, of course, means to grow not just one thing, but a diverse set of things. So not just cotton, but cotton and corn and wheat. Therefore, if one crop fails, you do better because, well, you might get something else. That was not true. Plantation owners did not learn that lesson. And so if you had a cotton plantation before the war, you continued to grow cotton. So the closest answer, the one that works best, is number 2. Owners of large tracts of land faced labor shortages, and as we said, sharecropping was a way to get the ex-slaves to continue working the land for them. But it was also a way to keep them sort of permanently down. Okay, now let's look at 17, excuse me. United States government's use of laissez-faire principles during the late 19th century resulted in what? Okay, let's remember laissez-faire is French. I should be maybe doing this with you. Okay, laissez-faire up here. Whoops, French term. And it means to leave something alone, right? To let it be, to let it do its thing. Laissez-faire principles in economics means that the government does nothing with regard to regulating or controlling business. So in a purely laissez-faire economy, business guys do whatever they want in their business, and the government doesn't make rules about it, doesn't interfere with it, doesn't get involved. We do not have a laissez-faire economy now. If you own a business, You are free to buy and sell. We have a capitalist system, but it is a regulated capitalism. So you can't lie in your advertising. There's a law about that. You can't pollute your neighbor's property. There's a law about that. If you're making certain kinds of products like food or medicine, it gets inspected by the government so that you're not doing something that's dangerous for people. There's laws about that. So we don't have a laissez-faire system now. Late 19th century, remember 19th century is 1800s, so you're talking 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. The government, particularly the federal government, took very little involvement in business. They did not make rules about it, and as a result, as you remember, I hope, this is the age, 1870s, 80s, 90s, of the monopolies. So you would get a strong businessman who would, using what today would be illegal tactics, either run every other guy in that industry out of business or take them over. So as you recall, John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil fame ran all of the other oil companies in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s out of business. At the time, they were not making gasoline. Oil companies made kerosene. So cars had not come along yet, but people lit their houses using oil lamps, and the oil they used was kerosene, which comes from the same thing. You take crude oil out of the ground, you pump it out of the ground, and you refine it, and you can make several different things with it. One is home heating oil, one is gasoline, another is kerosene. So at the time, kerosene was the big market in America because everybody lit their homes with kerosene. Rockefeller did two things. First, he didn't own a kerosene company. He owned everything from the oil in the ground to the guy who handed you the can of kerosene for your home. So he owned the land, the oil well, the pipeline to get the oil to the railroad. He made deals with the railroads to ship it to the refinery. The refinery then he owned, turned the crude oil into kerosene. He owned the transport companies to get the kerosene to the retailer business. He owned the retail business that sold it to the customer. That's called vertical integration. So from top to bottom, he owned each step in the process of making the product. And therefore, he's able to keep his costs down. If each of those parts was owned by a different guy, each guy would want to take a little bit of profit. And so the guy at the end of the line is paying more for his kerosene than he would if I own the whole process beginning to end. So I get really rich if I do that. Second, because he was able to make special deals with the transporting railroads, and because he was able to control the whole process from beginning to end, his costs were so cheap, he could run every other kerosene business out of business. And so by the time he was done, there was one company in America, Standard Oil, which owned in some way every, or actually more than 80 or 85% of the kerosene business in the whole country. That's called horizontal integration when you do that, because you own all the businesses horizontally in a particular industry. Once that happens, the consumer has no choice. If he wants kerosene to light his house, he's got one company he can go to. And therefore, that company can charge anything they want and produce any quality they want. They can give you really crappy quality kerosene and charge an arm and a leg for it because you don't have a choice to go anyplace else. No competition. So that it was called, of course, monopoly, or the trust. The trusts, as they were known, were the corporate structures they had, these holding companies that owned all the little companies that were really all part of the one big company. So you had the oil trust, the steel trust, the sugar trust, the meat trust, and so on and so on. John D. Rockefeller, of course, Standard Oil. Andrew Carnegie, the Carnegie Steel Company, owned most of the steel production in America and a big chunk of it in the whole world, actually. And you had Vanderbilt, and then later J.P. Morgan and Jim Fisk. These were other entrepreneurs who owned the railroad business and like that. Okay, so that laissez-faire, the government didn't interfere with any of this. Because the government said, you do your own thing, we're not going to get involved, these monopolies arose. Okay, in the early 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt, the trust buster, and then his successor, Taft, William Howard Taft, and then Woodrow Wilson, those presidents, all went after monopolies. You had a passage of the law called the Sherman Antitrust Act, a second one called the Clayton Antitrust Act, and a Supreme Court case called Northern Securities case. And guys, I hope you were taking notes on all of this, okay? If any of that is news to you, or you don't recognize a term I use or a guy I make reference to, you make a note in a notebook and go make sure you look it up. So the Sherman Antitrust Act, Clayton Antitrust Act, and the Northern Securities case were all part of busting those trusts, saying, nope, that's not real competition. And so we're going to break up those companies so that you actually have real people competing with each other. Okay, so when we look at this here, question 17, United States government's use of laissez-faire principles during the 19th century resulted in what? Commitment of aid to small American businesses. Nope, just the opposite. Government is not going to interfere with business, it's not going to help it, and it's not going to get in its way. So it's not going to give aid to small businesses. And in fact, small businesses got wiped out by the monopolies. 2, it led to a decline in the number of factory jobs. Just the opposite. As the economy boomed and as these businesses grew, factories increased, and more people left the farm, which is now being more efficiently run with technology, and went and took jobs in the factories in the cities. Number 3, opposition of American businesses to protective tariffs. Also not true. Protective tariffs were most of the time businesses like tariffs. Tariffs is that tax on imports, and it drives the price of imports up, which makes them more expensive than American-made products. So if you're an American company, you like tariffs. The growth of trusts and monopolies. Yep, U.S. government's use of laissez-faire principles, that is, keeping its hands off, led to the growth of monopolies and the synonym for that, trusts. Okay, number 18. What was one result of the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson? Okay, Plessy v. Ferguson, Supreme Court case, set in Louisiana. By 1890s, now we're after Reconstruction, you have in the South Jim Crow laws, which are all about segregation, keeping the races apart and basically discriminating against blacks. In Louisiana, there was a law. You had to have separate train facilities, railroad facilities for blacks and whites. So when you went to the train station, there was a whites-only waiting room and a blacks-only waiting room as you waited in the station for the train to come. And then when you got on the train, there were whites-only cars and blacks-only cars. Well, this guy Plessy sued and said, this is not fair. Why? Because the Constitution does not talk about black citizens and white citizens. It just talks about citizens. There's no such thing as a category of citizen. Therefore, if you make a law that does create a category, that does separate citizens for any reason, you are engaging in an unconstitutional separation of races. Just creating that category is itself wrong. On top of which, most of the time, the black accommodations were a lot worse than the white ones. The Supreme Court, though, when they heard the case, said, separate is okay as long as it's equal. And so, you see number 2 there, the separate but equal doctrine was established. The court said you could have separate railroad cars, separate train stations, separate whatever, separate bathrooms, separate restaurants. Separate is okay. Separate but equal. The dissenting, one of the justices on the Supreme Court, one of them, issued his own opinion saying that's wrong. John Marshall Harlan said, who was the justice at the time, said that's wrong. And his argument was what I just told you, that when you create categories of citizens that don't exist in the Constitution, we just have citizen and not citizen. We do not have black citizen or white citizen. You are engaging in an unconstitutional activity. The rest of the Supreme Court majority said, no, it's okay. Separate but equal is okay. As you know, in the 1950s, the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Brown v. Board, or Brown versus the Board of Education. The case came back to the Supreme Court. That was 60 years later. And that time, the Supreme Court said separate but equal is not okay, and ordered that schools be desegregated, quote, with all deliberate speed. And so in the 1950s, you get, as you remember, I hope, Little Rock, Arkansas. The Supreme Court ordered that the schools there be desegregated. The governor of Arkansas and the local school board said, we refuse to. We're not going to let black kids in our school. And so President Eisenhower had to send down the United States Army to enforce the law. And that happened again and again in Alabama, in Mississippi, all across the South through the 1950s. Those schools had to be desegregated, and the black kids would go, and they had to be protected by the Army to protect them from the hate and violence of some of the white students and white people, townspeople, if you will, the people from those states who opposed it. But that didn't happen until Brown v. Board. So Plessy v. Ferguson is separate but equal. Brown v. Board is the desegregation of the schools. And once the schools were desegregated, a lot of other things then had to be desegregated too. Okay. 1899. Let me just move this up here. Oops. Nope. Oops. Hang on. Okay. In 1899, the United States proclaimed the open door policy. What was the open door policy about? It was all about Asia, particularly China. Interesting. Much of American history has been driven by China. If you stop and think about it a minute, Christopher Columbus made his voyage that discovered the New World because he was looking for a way to get to China and bumped into North and South America instead. He was followed by the other explorers, including Giovanni da Verrazzano, who finds Staten Island and New York Harbor, and he was looking for a way around this continent called North America to take him to China. Once we become the United States of America, by the middle of the 1800s, we are looking for a way to build a railroad from the East Coast out to San Francisco as a way to get to China. By then we were trading with China, but it was shipping Took a long time, so we wanted to be able to bring ships into San Francisco and put goods on a railroad. That's the 1860s, 70s, 80s. The Panama Canal gets built because it shortens the route from the east coast of the United States and Europe to China. Interesting. Anyway, 1899, the European countries are all over trade with China. And each of them, if you remember from Global maybe, had its sphere of influence over there and its own trading agreements. Hong Kong was the base for the British, and Macau was the base for the Portuguese, and so on. The United States pushed this idea of the open door policy, the purpose of which, our idea was that everybody would get to trade with China equally and nobody would sort of have a monopoly on that. So it was a way to ensure trading opportunities in China. The Philippines were never going to attack China, number two there. The Philippines had nothing of an army or anything like that. The U.S. was not looking to increase trade between Russia and the U.S. We wouldn't have gone to the east for that. And prevent European colonies from colonizing Africa. We did not really have much of an interest in Africa at that time. Americans didn't. And the open door policy had nothing to do with Africa. So the only one that even comes close to making sense is number one there, trading opportunities with China. Okay, and now let's look at number 20. Speaker A, it's disgraceful that we allow children in this country to work long hours in unsafe, unsanitary conditions. The government must step in and protect our children. Speaker B, we must allow businesses to compete freely without government intervention. The best survive. Speaker B is laissez-faire. Speaker C, monopolies and trusts make it impossible for small businesses to compete. Monopolies lower their prices to eliminate competition, and then they charge consumers even higher prices. That's what we call that horizontal integration Speaker C is talking about. You run all the other businesses out of business. And Speaker D, big business is good for the country. It increases the nation's wealth, provides jobs, and strengthens the country. Okay. What would Speaker B most likely want the federal government to do? Speaker B is, we said, that laissez-faire guy. Would he want to regulate child labor? No, he doesn't want rules about business at all. Adopt a progressive income tax. Progressive income tax means the wealthier pay a larger percentage. So if you're poor, you pay, say, 10%, and if you're rich, you pay, say, 20%. On the grounds that, 10% to a poor guy is the difference between whether he gets to eat lunch or not. 20% to a very wealthy guy, he doesn't even notice. Clearly, Speaker B would not be in favor of that. Strengthen immigration laws. No, Speaker B would probably like free immigration, as many immigrants as possible, because that gives you more cheap labor for your business. Support the concept of social Darwinism. Well, that's what he's talking about. Let the guys who can compete survive, and if you're too weak to make it in this laissez-faire, no holds barred, no rules competition, then you should just die off and disappear. That's social Darwinism. So Speaker B really is number 4. Which two speakers represent the beliefs of many reformers of the progressive era? Well, the reformers were all about making society better using government rules. So, ending child labor and unsanitary conditions, changing business rules so that little guys have a fair competition. You don't give them a hand, but you give them fair rules so that they can fairly compete with the big guys. Speakers A and C are really that progressive era reform movement. So that would be number 2 there. Okay, we'll leave it at this one and pick up with question 22 in the next video.